every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The sound of children's laughter on a warm June evening is one of the most reassuring sounds in the world. It's the sound of safety, of community, of a day winding down into a peaceful night. In Villisca, Iowa, on Sunday, June 9, 1912, that sound filled the air around the town's Presbyterian church. It was the annual Children's Day service, a culmination of weeks of practice and preparation, and Sarah Moore had organized it all. Her 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, were all participating, their voices joining the chorus. With them were 2 friends, Lena and Ina Stillinger, sisters who were staying the night at the Moore house as a special treat. Villisca was a place built on such moments. A town of just 2,000 souls, carved out of the rolling hills of southwestern Iowa. It was a hub of commerce and community, connected to the wider world by the humming tracks of the Burlington Northern Railroad. It was a place where people knew their neighbors, where doors were often left unlocked, and where the greatest anxieties were the price of corn or the threat of a summer drought. The idea that a monstrous, predatory evil could be walking its quiet streets was not just unlikely, it was functionally impossible, a dark fantasy from the Grimm's fairy tales read to children at bedtime. As the service ended around 9:30 that night, the congregation spilled out into the twilight. The Moore family, accompanied by the Stillinger sisters, began the short walk home to their modest 2-story white clapboard house at 508 East 2nd Street. They were likely tired, but happy, the children buzzing with the excitement of their performance. They would have walked up the porch steps, turned the key in the lock, and stepped inside, leaving the safety of the community behind them and entering the privacy of their home. They were unaware that they were not alone, unaware that something or someone was already waiting for them, concealed in the shadows of the attic, listening to their final, unknowing moments of life. By sunrise the next morning, all 8 of them would be dead, bludgeoned to death in their beds by an axe. The discovery would reveal a crime scene so brutal, so methodical, and so profoundly strange that it would defy explanation for more than a century. The killer didn't just take lives, they performed a kind of ritual, leaving behind a tableau of unsettling clues, covered mirrors, a bowl of bloody water, a slab of bacon, that seemed to mock the investigators who would come to stare in disbelief. The search for the Villisca axe murderer would tear the town apart, turning neighbor against neighbor, and would unearth a cast of suspects ranging from a powerful state senator to a traveling preacher who claimed to have seen visions from God. Tonight on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a small-town slaughter. We will explore a crime scene that feels less like a historical event and more like the birth of a dark American legend. We will examine the botched investigation and the web of suspicion that ensnared an entire community, asking not only who could commit such an act, but why the scene was left in such a bizarre, ceremonial state. This is the story of the silence that fell over Villisca, a silence carved by an axe which has never truly been broken. To understand the depth of the horror that befell Villisca, you first have to understand the family at its center. Josiah B. Moore, known to everyone as J.B., was a pillar of the community, but a pillar with sharp edges. At 43, he was one of the town's most successful and aggressive businessmen. He owned the Moore Implement Company, a direct and bitter competitor to his former employer, Frank F. Jones. J.B. had worked for Jones for years before striking out on his own in 1908, and when he left, he managed to secure the lucrative John Deere franchise, a move that permanently soured his relationship with the older, more established Jones. JB was known as a hard-working, straight-laced man, but also as someone who was driven, perhaps a bit arrogant, and not afraid to make enemies in the pursuit of success. In a small town, that kind of ambition is often admired, but just as often it is resented. His wife, Sarah Montgomery Moore, 39, was the heart of the family and a prominent figure in the town's social and religious life. Where JB was focused on business, Sarah was focused on the church and their children. She was the one who coordinated the Children's Day program, a role that put her at the very center of the community's life that final Sunday. She was described as a loving mother and a devout Christian, a woman who embodied the stable, wholesome values of her time and place. Their 4 children were a staircase of ages. Herman, at 11, was the oldest, a boy on the cusp of adolescence. Then came Catherine, 10, known for her love of books and performance. Boyd was 7, and little Paul was just 5 years old. They were, by all accounts, typical children of the era, attending school, doing chores, and finding their world largely confined to the safe boundaries of their small town. They were known and loved by their neighbors. Rounding out the household on that fateful night were Lena and Ina Stillinger, ages 12 and 8. They were the daughters of Joseph and Sarah Stillinger, who lived in the nearby countryside. The girls had come into town to participate in the church program, and were invited by their friend Catherine Moore to spend the night. An overnight stay was a thrilling adventure for children of that age. For Lena and Ina, it was a sleepover they would never wake up from. Their inclusion in the slaughter adds another layer of senseless tragedy to the event. They were not Moors. They were simply in the wrong house on the wrong night, innocent guests caught in a storm of violence directed at their hosts. The Moore house itself was a simple, wood-frame home, respectable but not ostentatious. Downstairs there was a parlor, a sitting room and a kitchen. Just off the parlor was a small bedroom. Upstairs, a narrow staircase led to 2 more bedrooms. This layout is critical to understanding the methodical nature of the crime. On the night of June 9th, JB and Sarah slept in the upstairs master bedroom. In the other upstairs bedroom were their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. Downstairs, in the guest room off the parlor, slept the 2 Stillinger sisters, Lena and Ina. After returning from the church service sometime between 9:30 and 10 p.m., the family likely followed a simple routine. Cookies and milk were left on the dining room table, a small snack before bed. The children would have changed into their nightclothes and been tucked into their beds. JB and Sarah would have been the last to retire. The town of Villisca settled into a deep, quiet sleep, secure in the belief that the world was as it should be. But inside the Moore house, a silent predator was waiting, having likely entered the home earlier and concealed himself in the small attic space, listening, biding his time until the house fell completely still. The only evidence of his vigil were 2 spent cigarettes found later by investigators. A faint trace of a presence that had watched and waited for the perfect moment to descend. The morning of Monday, June 10th, dawned bright and clear. In Villisca, Mondays began early. But at the Moore residence, an unnatural quiet persisted. Mary Peckham, their next-door neighbor, was the first to notice something was wrong. The Moores were always up with the sun, the house bustling with the activity of getting 4 children ready for the day. But on this morning there was no movement. The curtains were still drawn. The chickens hadn't been fed. Around 7:30 a.m., after her concern had grown for some time, she walked over and knocked on the front door. There was no answer. She tried the handle. It was locked. She let the chickens out of their co-op in the backyard, a neighborly gesture, but her anxiety was mounting. She then called J.B. Moore's brother Ross Moore, a local pharmacist. She told him about the stillness, the silence from the house that felt deeply wrong. Ross tried to brush it off, suggesting the family was simply overtired from the church activities the night before. But Peckham was insistent. Something wasn't right. Finally, Ross arrived at the house. He knocked loudly, calling out for his brother. The silence that answered him was heavy, absolute. He tried his own key, but it wouldn't turn in the lock. Peering through a window, he could see nothing amiss. Frustrated and now genuinely worried, he got a spare house key from J.B.'s hardware store. But that one didn't work either. He returned with a tire iron and forced the front door open, the sound of splintering wood echoing on the quiet street. He stepped inside. The first room he entered was the downstairs parlor. It was dim, the shades drawn tight against the morning sun. To his left was the guest bedroom. He pushed the door open and peered inside. On the bed he saw two small figures under a blanket. He also saw dark, crimson stains soaked into the bedding. In that instant he knew. He didn't go any further. He backed out of the house, his face pale, and told Mary Peckham what he had seen. His instruction to her was simple and stark: get the marshal. Town Marshal Hank Horton was the first lawman on the scene, but he was far from the last. As news of the discovery spread through Villisca's telephone party lines, a morbid curiosity took hold. Within an hour, a crowd had gathered outside the Moore house. And in what would become the single greatest failure of the investigation, Horton and the other early arrivals allowed dozens of townspeople to stream through the home. They walked through the parlor, up the narrow stairs, and into the bedrooms, their feet trampling over potential evidence, their hands touching walls and doorknobs. It was a carnival of horror, driven by a community's collective shock. By the time any semblance of control was established, the crime scene was hopelessly and irrevocably contaminated. The killer's tracks, if there ever were any, had been obliterated by the muddy boots and curious fingerprints of half the town. What those townspeople saw, and what investigators would later piece together, was a scene of methodical, almost ritualistic carnage. The killer had moved through the house with a chilling purpose. He had started upstairs in the master bedroom with J.B. and Sarah Moore. Both had been killed by savage blows to the head from the blunt pole end of an axe. Based on the extensive damage to J.B.'s face, investigators believed he was the first to be attacked and had received more blows than any other victim, suggesting he was the primary target. The killer then moved to the other upstairs bedroom and systematically murdered the four Moore children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, in the same brutal fashion. The force of the swings was so great that gouges were found in the ceiling above Herman and Catherine's bed. After eliminating everyone on the second floor, the killer went downstairs to the guest bedroom and murdered the two visiting Stillinger sisters, Lena and Ina. In every case, the victims were found in their beds, likely attacked while they slept, with no signs of a struggle except for 12-year-old Lena Stillinger. She was found lying crosswise on the bed, and a defensive wound was found on her arm, suggesting she may have been briefly awake during the attack. After each victim was killed, their face was covered with a piece of bedding or clothing, a gesture that has been interpreted as a sign of remorse, or perhaps a way for the killer to avoid looking at what he had done. The weapon, J.B. Moore's own axe, was found in the downstairs guest room, leaning against a wall. It had been wiped down, but not thoroughly, and was still sticky with blood and matted with hair. The blade end had not been used. All the fatal blows were delivered with the heavy pole, a detail that speaks to an intent to crush rather than to cut. The choice of weapon, taken from the Moore's own coal shed, suggested the killer came unarmed, or at least preferred to use what was available on site. But it was the other details, the small, strange arrangements left behind by the killer, that elevated the crime from a simple, brutal murder to something far more sinister and baffling. Every mirror in the house, including the glass on the front and back doors, had been draped with cloth. This act, with its overtones of superstition and folklore, suggested a killer who was perhaps afraid of seeing his own reflection, or who believed in old tales about spirits being trapped in mirrors. In the kitchen, a bowl of bloody water was found on a table, indicating the killer had attempted to wash his hands before leaving. Beside it was a plate of uneaten food from the family's icebox. This detail paints a disturbing picture of a killer calm enough after committing 8 murders to pause for a snack, though he apparently didn't finish it. More bizarrely still, leaning against the wall in the downstairs bedroom, near the axe, was a 2-pound slab of bacon taken from the icebox. It was wrapped in a dish towel. This detail has no logical explanation. It appears to be a form of signature, a piece of a private ritual whose meaning was known only to the killer. Another strange clue was a keychain left on the floor of the kitchen, which did not belong to the Moores. This was one of the few pieces of potential evidence that didn't belong in the house. But in the chaos, it was picked up and handled by several people before being secured. The doors were all locked from the inside. The killer had exited, presumably through the back door, and locked it behind him, suggesting he either had a key or knew how to manipulate the lock from the outside. He then vanished into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving behind a house of silent death, a puzzle box of bizarre clues, and a town that would never feel safe again. The anatomy of this slaughter wasn't just in the violence. It was in the eerie, deliberate staging of the scene, a performance for an audience that wouldn't arrive for hours. The investigation into the Villisca murders was, from the very beginning, a study in chaos and jurisdictional conflict. The town marshal, Hank Horton, was a man equipped to handle public drunkenness and petty theft, not a mass murder of incomprehensible brutality. County officials soon arrived, followed by detectives from the renowned Burns Detective Agency, hired by the city of Villisca and private citizens. This influx of different law enforcement bodies with different methods and different motives led to infighting, jealousy, and a critical lack of coordinated effort. Evidence was mishandled. Leads were not properly pursued, and theories multiplied like weeds in the fertile ground of fear and confusion. The first theory to take hold, as it often does in such cases, was that this was the work of a wandering vagrant or a mentally disturbed transient. The railroad that was Villisca's lifeblood also made it vulnerable. Hundreds of unknown men passed through the town every day. Bloodhounds were brought in, but they lost the killer's scent near the West Nottoway River, reinforcing the idea that the murderer had simply hopped a freight train and disappeared forever. One transient, a man named Andy Sawyer, became a person of interest when a railroad crew boss reported him. The boss claimed Sawyer arrived in his work camp early on the morning of June 10th, knowing details about the murders before they were public knowledge. Sawyer was also strangely obsessed with the case and allegedly slept with an axe by his side. He was arrested and interrogated, but the local sheriff, convinced Sawyer was just a harmless eccentric, eventually let him go. He was never seen again. The lead, whether credible or not, dissolved into thin air. But as the initial shock wore off, suspicion began to turn inward, focusing on men within the community, men with possible motives rooted in the very fabric of Villisca's social and economic life. And no name was whispered with more fear and reverence than that of Frank F. Jones. Jones was not just a prominent citizen, he was an institution. A wealthy businessman and a powerful state senator, he had once been J.B. Moore's employer. Their relationship had fractured when J.B. left to start his own competing implement store, taking the highly profitable John Deere dealership with him. The rivalry was public and acrimonious. In a small town, a business feud of that magnitude was a serious affair. But the rumored motive went deeper than business. Gossip, a potent currency in towns like Villisca, suggested that J.B. Moore was having an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law, Donna. While no concrete evidence of this affair has ever been produced, the rumor was persistent enough to provide a powerful personal motive for a man like Frank Jones, not just business revenge, but the defense of his family's honor. Jones was a man of immense influence. He was known to be ruthless and was not someone to be crossed. Many townspeople, and even some investigators, believed that he had the power to obstruct the investigation, to intimidate witnesses, and to ensure that the finger of suspicion never formally pointed his way. Although he was questioned, he was never seriously considered a suspect by the authorities, a fact many found highly suspect in itself. The theory was that Jones, too old or too prominent to commit the act himself, had hired an outside professional to do his dirty work. This theory led investigators to a man named William Blackie Mansfield. Mansfield was a sinister figure, a career criminal and suspected murderer from Blue Island, Illinois. He was believed to be a killer for hire, a man who specialized in precisely this kind of brutal, close-quarters violence. What made Mansfield a particularly compelling suspect was his potential connection to a string of terrifyingly similar axe murders that had occurred across the Midwest. In September 1911 in Colorado Springs, a family of 4 and their 2 overnight guests were killed in their beds with an axe. In Monmouth, Illinois, another family was killed in the same manner. In Ellsworth, Kansas, a husband, wife, and their infant child were murdered with an axe. In each case, the victims were killed as they slept. The killer used an axe found on the property, mirrors were sometimes covered, and the axe was often left at the scene. The similarities were so striking that some detectives became convinced they were hunting one of America's first traveling serial killers, a man who moved along the railroad lines, murdering families for reasons only he understood. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, investigating the murder in Kansas, had identified Mansfield as their prime suspect when a detective from the Burns Agency, James Wilkerson, began investigating Villisca. He became convinced that Frank Jones had hired Mansfield to kill J.B. Moore, and that Mansfield, a man who killed for sport as much as for pay, had simply slaughtered the entire family as part of his gruesome signature. Wilkerson's investigation revealed that Mansfield had been in the general vicinity of Villisca around the time of the murders. He even managed to break Mansfield's alibi, proving that payroll records from his job in Illinois had been falsified. In 1916, 4 years after the murders, Wilkerson finally succeeded in having Mansfield arrested and brought before a grand jury in Montgomery County, Iowa. The case against him seemed strong. He fit the profile, he was linked to similar crimes, and his alibi was fraudulent. The town of Villisca held its breath, believing justice was finally at hand. But the grand jury, after hearing the evidence, declined to issue an indictment. The evidence, while tantalizing, was entirely circumstantial. There was nothing to physically place William Mansfield inside the Moore house. He was released, and the most promising lead in the case evaporated. Wilkerson would go to his grave believing that Frank Jones and Blackie Mansfield were responsible, and that Jones's immense political power had thwarted justice. Just when it seemed the case had reached a dead end, it took a bizarre and dramatic turn with the emergence of a new and utterly improbable suspect. The Reverend George Kelly. Kelly was an English-born traveling minister who had been a guest preacher in Villisca on the day of the murders. He had even attended the Children's Day program on that final Sunday evening. He was known for his eccentric, often erratic behavior. He suffered from documented mental illness and had a history as a peeping Tom. He left Villisca on a train at 5 o'clock in the morning on June 10th, just hours after the murders were committed. In the days following the murders, he began sending strange letters to the authorities and to the Moore family, demonstrating an obsessive interest in the case. Fellow passengers on the train he took out of town later reported that he had been distraught, talking to himself, and nervously rubbing his hands. He allegedly confessed to a seatmate that he had seen a vision of 2 little bodies covered in blood, and that he needed to turn back. Later, it was discovered that he had sent a bloody shirt to be laundered a few days after leaving Villisca, a detail that, while suspicious, was never definitively linked to the crime. For years, Kelly remained on the periphery of the investigation, a person of interest but not a prime suspect. That changed in 1917, when he was arrested in South Dakota for sending obscene material through the mail. While in custody, he was interrogated about the Villisca murders. After hours of intense questioning, George Kelly broke down and confessed. His confession was astonishingly detailed. He described a voice in his head, a divine command, telling him he must slay utterly the Moore family. He claimed he had followed them home from the church, waited for them to fall asleep, and then carried out the slaughter as a sacrifice to God. The confession was a bombshell. The state of Iowa finally had its man. In the fall of 1917, George Kelly was put on trial for the murder of Lena Stillinger. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on his confession. They painted him as a religious fanatic, a sexually deviant and mentally unstable man who had given in to his darkest impulses. But the defense mounted a powerful counteroffensive. They argued that the confession was coerced, the product of a mentally vulnerable man being relentlessly browbeaten by skilled interrogators. They pointed out numerous inconsistencies between Kelly's confession and the facts of the crime scene. He got details wrong about the layout of the house and the sequence of the murders. And crucially, there was not a single piece of physical evidence connecting him to the crime. The people of Villisca were deeply divided. Some saw Kelly as the monster who had haunted their town for 5 years. Others saw him as a pathetic and convenient scapegoat, a man being railroaded to close a case that had embarrassed law enforcement. The first trial ended in a hung jury, with 11 jurors voting for acquittal and only 1 for conviction. The state, determined to get a conviction, decided to try him again. The second trial, held a few months later, was largely a repeat of the first. This time, the defense was even more effective at dismantling the confession and portraying Kelly as a victim of police pressure. After just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict, not guilty. Reverend George Kelly walked out of the courtroom a free man, and with his acquittal, the last best hope for a legal resolution to the Villisca axe murders died. The case had produced a powerful local suspect with a clear motive, a potential serial killer with a terrifyingly similar M.O., and a disturbed preacher with a detailed confession. Yet none of it was enough. The investigation had been so compromised from the start, the evidence so thin, that guilt could never be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The case officially went cold, but the mystery continued to fester. The aftermath of the failed trials was, in many ways, as tragic as the murders themselves. The town of Villisca, once a symbol of Midwestern solidarity, became a community poisoned by suspicion. With the courts unable to provide an answer, the court of public opinion took over. Two main factions emerged. One group remained convinced that Frank Jones was the mastermind, that his money and influence had bought the silence of witnesses and the loyalty of officials, effectively placing him above the law. They saw the focus on transients and oddballs like Reverend Kelly as a deliberate misdirection, a smokescreen to protect the town's most powerful citizen. This belief created a deep and lasting rift, isolating Jones and his supporters from a significant portion of the community. Friendships ended, business relationships dissolved, and a cloud of resentment hung over the town for decades. The other faction believed in the guilt of Reverend Kelly. To them, his confession, however flawed, was the truth spoken by a man whose soul was tormented. They saw his acquittal as a failure of the justice system, a legal technicality that allowed a monster to go free. They viewed Kelly as a cunning manipulator who used his feigned mental instability to escape responsibility for his horrific acts. This division ran so deep that people who had lived side by side their entire lives could no longer look each other in the eye. The murders had created a wound, and the failed investigation had poured salt into it, ensuring it would never properly heal. The Moore House on East 2nd Street became a grim landmark. For years, it sat vacant or was rented to tenants who never stayed long, reporting strange noises, feelings of unease, and the ghostly laughter of children. It was a physical reminder of the unresolved horror, a monument to the town's collective trauma. The story was passed down through generations, becoming a dark piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale whispered to children. The brutal facts of the case became intertwined with ghost stories and legends, blurring the line between history and myth. The key figures in the drama lived out the rest of their lives under the shadow of June 10, 1912. Frank F. Jones died in 1941, a wealthy and successful man who was nonetheless haunted by the accusations that followed him to his grave. William Blackie Mansfield was later implicated in other crimes, but was never convicted for any of the axe murders he was suspected of committing. He died in Leavenworth Penitentiary after a failed escape attempt. Reverend George Kelly faded into obscurity, his name forever linked to a crime for which he was acquitted but never truly exonerated. His life after the trials was quiet, and he died in 1959. The Villisca axe murder case has been studied and re-examined countless times by historians and amateur sleuths. New theories have emerged, including one focusing on another serial killer of the era, Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the victims, who committed a similar axe murder in Missouri months after Villisca. But every new theory runs into the same wall: the complete absence of definitive physical evidence, the contaminated crime scene, the passage of time, and the lack of forensic science in 1912 created a perfect storm for an unsolvable crime. The truth of what happened that night was carried away by the killer, leaving only questions behind. Who could slaughter 6 children? Why were the mirrors covered? What was the meaning of the bacon and the bowl of bloody water? These questions have echoed for more than a century unanswered. In the end, the anatomy of the Villisca axe murders is not the anatomy of a successful investigation or a just conviction. It is the anatomy of a perfect crime, and more profoundly, the anatomy of a town's destruction. The killer didn't just wield an axe. He wielded fear and suspicion, and the damage he inflicted went far beyond the walls of the Moore home. He turned a trusting community into a cauldron of paranoia, proving that the deepest wounds are often the ones we inflict on ourselves in the wake of a tragedy. The physical slaughter was over in a matter of minutes, but the social and psychological slaughter of Villisca would continue for generations. The case stands as a chilling artifact from a transitional period in American history. It was a crime that belonged to the lawless, brutal past, yet it occurred at the dawn of a more modern, scientific age. It was investigated with the primitive tools of one era, while requiring the sophisticated forensic and psychological understanding of another. This gap between the nature of the crime and the ability of society to comprehend it is where the mystery of Villisca was born and where it continues to reside. Circling back to the central theme, the anatomy of this small-town slaughter is a complex and layered thing. On one level, it is about the physical evidence, the strange and ritualistic details that have fascinated and baffled observers for over 100 years. The covered mirrors suggest a killer grappling with superstition or shame. The uneaten meal and the attempt to wash up paint a picture of a perpetrator who was both brazen and meticulous. The slab of bacon remains the most inscrutable clue, a piece of surrealism, dropped into the middle of a nightmare. Perhaps a symbolic gesture or simply a random, meaningless act that our pattern-seeking brains refuse to accept as such. On another level, its anatomy is psychological. What kind of mind could carry out such an act? The methodical annihilation of an entire family, including 6 young children, points to a profound lack of empathy, a personality disconnected from the fundamental norms of human behavior. Was it the cold, calculated rage of a business rival, carried out by proxy? Was it the work of a sexual sadist, a lust killer like Blackie Mansfield, who derived pleasure from the act itself? Or was it the product of a diseased mind, like that of Reverend Kelly, who believed he was carrying out a divine commandment? Each suspect offers a different path into the darkness, a different psychology of a killer, and because the case remains unsolved, all these possibilities continue to coexist. But perhaps the most important layer of this case's anatomy is societal. It reveals the fragility of a community. Villisca in 1912 believed itself to be an island of safety and civility. The murders shattered that illusion completely and irrevocably. The subsequent investigation, riddled with incompetence and possibly corruption, eroded faith in the institutions meant to protect the public. The spread of rumors and the casting of suspicion turned neighbor against neighbor, demonstrating how quickly fear can unravel the social contract. The Villisca axe murders didn't just happen to a family. They happened to a town, exposing the fault lines of jealousy, resentment, and paranoia that lay just beneath the surface of a seemingly idyllic community. The crime became a mirror, and when the town looked into it, it did not like the reflection. Today, the Moore House still stands on East 2nd Street, preserved as a museum. People pay to walk through its rooms, to stand in the spaces where the family slept and died, hoping to feel a connection to the past, to perhaps glean some insight that has been missed for a century. It has become a site of paranormal investigation, a place where the tragedy has been commodified into a ghost story. But the true horror of Villisca has nothing to do with ghosts. It has to do with the terrifyingly real capacity for human violence and the enduring pain of unanswered questions, the house is not just a monument to the 8 people who lost their lives there. It is a monument to a mystery that has become part of America's dark heritage. The identity of the person who waited in the attic, who picked up J.B. Moore's axe, and who methodically moved from room to room extinguishing lives, remains unknown. That person walked out of the house, locked the door, and melted back into the world, taking the truth with them. They left behind a legacy not of evidence or answers, but of silence. The white clapboard house, on the quiet Iowa street, remains the only witness that will never speak. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.